Hi, I'm John Dunn. I work here at Valdosta State University. I've been here since 1997. I teach history classes for Valdosta State University and teach a two-part world military history class, which might connect me to the story of the B-29. So one of the aspects of this B-29 that connects to the bigger story of how the U.S. government is prioritizing projects for winning the war. It's the most expensive program Uncle Sam put together during World War II. It is even more than the Manhattan Project. And of course, the Manhattan Project produces the bomb that will be delivered by a B-29 over Japan, over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But B-29 program, highest priority because U.S. Army Air Force was, since the 1930s, thinking that heavy bombers were going to tremendously influence the next war. And I'm sure you probably have already heard this speech Hitler made in 1939, right before the war started, where he told the German people in 5 years they wouldn't recognize their cities. And if you talk to some bomber pilots from World War II, they said they were trying to keep Hitler honest. Another thing that intrigues me about B-29s and the entire U.S. war economy from let's say 40, because we're already starting under the Lend-Lease program sending supplies to the British, but 1941 to 45, we have rationing in this country. If you're a civilian and you have a car, if you have a car, because there's no cars being produced anymore, all of the factories are converting over into producing Jeeps or Sherman tanks or the B-29 bombers. You can't buy a car. You might get lucky and get a recap tire because rubber is in short supply. Ladies don't get silk stockings anymore. You'll see advertisements for paint you can put on your leg to make it look like you have a stocking. Some people will get a pen and they'll draw a line up the back of their leg to pretend they have a stocking because we need silk for parachutes. We need rubber for tires, but for army trucks, for Jeeps, all the items that we take for granted as being part of an economy, there's severe restrictions. There's rations on how much food you can get. No one's starving under this ration system, but there are definitely limitations. And of course, if you want to say bonus to the American economy is no one's spending much money from 1941 to 45. When the war ends, we have this tremendous savings of cash and a pent-up desire to buy a car or to get a house or to buy, a fabulous set of silk stockings that you couldn't get during the war. So the B-29 is competing with all kinds of other priorities during this wartime effort. It's the most expensive program during World War II. The design of the B-29 bomber, the total cost of making this bomber successful was even higher than the Manhattan Project. But whether it's Manhattan Project, B-29, Sherman tanks, everybody is fighting in Washington to get their project prioritized, and there's a limit on the resources even of the greatest industrial power in the world. So that's also part of this B-29 story.
Well, history of the B-29, originally they were looking for a long-range aircraft that maybe could go to Europe because it was very tenuous in the late 30s and into the early 40s as to whether or not England would survive or be invaded by Germany. So then how would you be able to fly missions there? So that was part of the thinking early on. Some part of the specifications early on, can you go that far? But it fairly quickly changed to be more centric to Japan. And there you still needed to go long distances. You had to have a 3,500 mile range on it because you had 1,500 miles up, fly around up there and come back. So I don't have the exact year month in my head, but I think it was late 39 that they were putting out the perspective on it. And by 40, or maybe it was even into 41, they had their first plan for how they're going to build this airplane. And I think in 42, they had a prototype going. don't hold me exactly to those years, but it was very early on in the 40s. And there from there, they continued to enhance it. Like the first ones had 3-bladed props, and then they put 4-bladed props on them by the time they were doing additional testing. Of course, there were 4 different factories that were building them in. It was a strategic weapon that Hap Arnold knew had to be used in a certain way in order to be effective. So a lot of how the 29 came about had to do with Hap Arnold, who really wanted to control this thing very, very carefully, because during the war, everybody wanted the latest and greatest weapon. So they wanted it for Europe, they wanted it for all kinds of different purposes, and he kept control of it. Then, of course, the initial issue was where do you base it? Because we didn't have the Marianas Islands available to us. They were still held by the Japanese. So anyway, the development of the aircraft is more to your question. The progression, of course, on engines was the main thing. And even though later in the war, they thought they had improved the engines quite a bit, those still were not very reliable from our standards. They certainly were compared to the very early engines. So they were continually upgrading them during the wartime. Because they were producing the airplanes before they actually had proven them, they were continually upgrading and upgrading and upgrading. So you roll an airplane out of the factory and it's way behind what the modifications were required. How do you modify the aircraft after they came out? How do you do it in the middle of winter? How do you do it under the extreme press of time? This is happening, in 44, in early 44, to get the airplanes out, get them out there and start to fly missions with them. Initially to India, to fly out of China, and then later with the Marianas, getting squadrons of aircraft to the, Tinian and Saipan and Guam. Tremendous effort. And then continue to improve the airplanes. It served strictly against the targets in Japan. This was during World War II. In Korea, it was used also, but it was produced and sent to first India, to go to China, to bomb Japan. Then when the Marianas Islands became available, it flew from there to do the bombings of the Japanese mainland.
I had a friend in Fort Lauderdale back in the 1970s, Mr. Robert Lamb, who was a navigator on a B-29, and he told me some interesting stories. He was stationed out in the Pacific, and he was working with the people who were doing bombing runs against the Japanese home islands. And he was telling me about General Curtis LeMay had come up with some new strategies, and these new strategies were based on how the American intelligence was kind of judging Japanese anti-aircraft defenses. And the judgment was the Japanese did not have a lot of planes that could fly at very high altitude, and that the B-29 could fly very rapidly at high altitude. And so maybe the B-29 could have some of its armament, its defensive armament, taken away. It could then increase the range, increase the bomb load. And Lamb said the pilots and crew were not too super happy with this, but it was a fact that at very high altitudes, the Japanese had few planes that could intercept them, and the anti-aircraft guns also had difficulty hitting targets. That I think the B-29 had a altitude 30,000 feet or so, and at that range, the anti-aircraft guns, it was not too easy to hit a target that moving that fast at that high up. Later, Mr. Lamb told me, I remember this story because he was quite perturbed. LeMay had them flying at lower altitudes because they were dropping all kinds of incendiary ordnance over Japanese cities, and they want them to get a little closer. Of course, getting closer made them much more susceptible to interception if the Japanese had night fighters, and also the anti-aircraft batteries would have a better chance to hit them. But LeMay was a person that really was a proponent of an Air Force can win the war and can win the war by massive bombing. And of course, LeMay's career continued, I think, into the late 50s, early 60s.
And then the atomic bombs, of course. So although the bombing was effective, the Japanese were also very, very stubborn, very resilient. They were not going to give an inch. And so with the atomic bombs, finally got their attention enough that would bring hostilities to an end. So that was the mission of the 29, strategic bombing of Japan. And by the time that CIF acquired Fifi, the engines still were overheating and didn't last very long, not very many hours. And you overhaul, put a new engine on, and it didn't last very many hours. So it really wasn't tenable after a while to continue to fly it like that. So, but aside from the B-29s, the engines on that, the 3350s, continued to be developed and improved, and they were used in other aircraft. They were on the PV-2 Navy aircraft, submarine hunter. They were used on the Sky Raider, single engine aircraft in Vietnam. They were used on the C-119 cargo aircraft. And those engines were quite reliable. Why? Because they continued to improve, to improve, to improve. So in 2010, when we acquired the new engines, these engines were still 3350s, but they were the all improved model. So we don't have, under normal operations, temperature issues. We don't have overheating issues if you're handling them in a normal manner. So you can still abuse it, do, a lot of high power something or other. And like for training, you got to be a little careful so you don't get them hot. But by and large, that problem is solved. And then things like nose wheel steering. The B-29s didn't have the advantage of that improvement, but the B-50s, which were an enhanced B-29 basically, that did have nose wheel steering, they also had reversing props. Some of the silver plates did. The Enola Gay had reversing props, and that helps a great deal for decelerating. Otherwise, you bring in a heavy airplane and depending on brakes. Most of it has to do with either on the ground operation, either taxiing during takeoff, a little less so during landing, but even flying at slow speeds. And that has to do with the fact that it doesn't respond real well, on slower speeds. So for us on takeoff, for example, it does not have nose wheel steering. And so you are just using asymmetric thrust on takeoff. And sometimes that's no big deal. Sometimes it's a real challenge. For one thing, you can't always predict, with 4 engines, 4 props, how synchronized they're going to be. Even if you're doing a good job with the levers, it doesn't mean that the engines are coming up evenly. Okay. So it's a lot of horsepower out there that can be asymmetric depending on how the power is coming up with a normal left turning tendency because of all the direction the props all turn. That can be a challenge. And once you're airborne, you have to have a minimum of 125 miles per hour if you lose an engine in order to maintain control. So you're getting close to that on takeoff. You might be a little bit under that. So you have to get the acceleration going. And you've got a little bit of a critical area there. It's not too bad on this airplane. Others, World War II aircraft, were far worse. And then until you get up to speed, the controls are fairly heavy. And it takes quite a bit to get it to react. On acceleration, it's not that big of an issue. When you come in to land, you want to be sure that you're keeping your speed up, 160 miles an hour, 150 maybe as your turning final. If you get slower than that, you may have pretty much full aileron or full rudder, and you don't want to be in that position. So how do you counter that? And one is really good procedures, understanding that those things are there and focusing on those don't get slow, minimize the amount of time where controllability is an issue.
I am William Mark Godwin. I am a Valdosta State graduate 2020 in history. I am currently the 23rd Wing Historian at Moody Air Force Base here in Valdosta, Georgia. The B-29, known as the Super Fortress, was also used as a rescue platform from 1952 to 1956. It was called the SB-29, the S standing for service, and the aircraft was used with a life raft attached to the bottom of the aircraft. It was called an A3 that had survival equipment in it, food, water, for downed aircrew. And these SB-29s would basically fly over the China Sea and the Sea of Japan looking for downed aircrew during the Korean War. And once they spotted the aircrew, they would parachute drop this raft to the survivors. These rafts would have water and food and medical supplies for the aircrew that were in the water that would basically hold them over till a ship sailed out to them to pluck them out of the water. The B-29 was also used during the Korean War as a leaflet bomb, or they would drop leaflet bombs that would have messages for people in towns basically saying surrender or something to lower the morale of those individuals. Or it would basically tell you if you want to live, you might want to leave this area at this time. The B-29, also known as Boxcar, was used on the second atomic bomb drop, which was on Nagasaki. That aircraft, after it completed its mission, it had a problem with fuel transfer and had fuel-starved engines, so they had to land at one of the alternate airstrips for the war because they were supposed to fly to another island. But the airstrip that they ended up going to was on Okinawa, which was north of Kadena Air Base. If you look on any like Google Maps, you could still kind of see the layout of the airfield where they landed, because it's not an operational airfield anymore. But like I said, it's about 10 miles north of Kadena Air Base. One interesting historic fact about both the Enola Gay and Boxcar B-29 missions in the atomic bomb drop over Hiroshima and Nagasaki is Lieutenant Jacob Bessier of Baltimore, Maryland, the radio countermeasure officer, was on both missions. So he got to witness history twice.
When I walk around that airplane today, I marvel at the engineering that goes into it. You know, we also fly the B-24 Liberator, and that was just a few years earlier. And the difference between the two is very stark. The engineering that went into this all-new airplane is really amazing, and it was very, very well done. It isn't just leading edge, but it was leading edge that was really well thought out. This tube, for example, that you're talking about, or the tunnel, it allowed, this big cockpit area, be pressurized, and as you say, go over 2 bomb bays and into the aft gunner's compartment. And then separately, far in the back, was a tail gunner who was also pressurized via an air tube that went back there. So you have 3 pressurized areas. And so how do you pressurize them? So the inboard engines would be off their super turbochargers that they're bleeding air off of, and temperature control as well. So what about temperature control? A huge advantage, save lives of crew, because in the other aircraft, you're standing out there in an open fuselage, windows open with hanging onto a gun. So here you can keep the temperature in your normal limits without having to have these huge suits on, and heated suits and oxygen mask on all the time. The gunnery system was just an amazing development, because there were no gunners in a turret. all the turrets were remote. So you have 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, plus tail. It's a turret as well, in that it was not manned directly. And the sighting, so how do you sight something like this at the higher speeds, higher altitudes? And this was done through, we call it an analog computer. But basically, part of it was actually mechanical setting. So it would transfer back and forth between electrical going through mechanical and back to compensate for things like altitude, airspeed, temperature, and build in a lead, so you're shooting ahead of the target. And it had to also have an offset for which gunners is shooting which gun. So pretty much any gunner could shoot any turret. You know, the bombardier was a gunner. He had a gun sight, and he normally shot the top and bottom forward turrets. He was the guy. But as he got close to his bombing run, say, okay, I got other things to do, guys. You guys got the guns. And then the central fire control would sat up on a sort of like a barber chair up into a bubble who could look all the way around the aircraft. He would then take control of the top and bottom forward turrets. And then you had left and right gunners. And each of those had a very sophisticated gun sight, which looks like a bomb sight. Very complicated. He's looking through a glass. He's got a reticle in there where he's looking at the target and bringing it in to focus, so to speak. How big is the wingspan and so forth, and bringing it in. And as he rotates, the guns are going up and down. As he rotates, the guns are moving side to side. And if something happens to him, or he loses sight of it, he can give control, or control can be taken by the other gunner for those turrets. Very sophisticated, and it worked quite well. There were a number of enhancements that were done over time, but it became pretty effective. They also, on the B-29, they started using radar pretty early in the game. They'd have a radar radome in the middle between the 2 bomb bays. It was used primarily to pick out the big things like a coastline, the shape of the island, and that kind of thing for targeting. You really couldn't pick out a plant or anything. Now later they had an enhanced version of the radar, which was more sophisticated. But I've used these analog radars, you know, on 727 and so on, where you could go into a ground mode, but it's pretty hard to pick out anything smaller than, you know, a city block or 2 or 5. You know, it's got to be pretty prominent to pick it out. So anyway, engineering marvel, this airplane. I'm totally impressed with the airplane, the engineering that went into it.